Sarhad Samvad, Season 2. Join us as we explore all kinds of borders across the world. Sarhad
Thank you. We today we have with us Professor Emmanuel Brunet-Jailly. He needs no introduction to the border studies community. Internationally, he is recognized, renowned for his work, uh, basically from University of Victoria, but is a person who has traveled to different countries, different parts of the world, contributed immensely to border studies, research. He also has a very vast research program, Big Borders in Globalization, and this is Borders in Globalization 2, Part 2. So thank you, Emmanuel, for joining us despite your very busy schedule, I know. And we wanted to have this interview for a long time. And thanks that today you agreed to give us some time for our Sarhad Samvad. Uh, we are in the turbulent times, Emmanuel. So, how do you see this change in international politics? What is new for the borders studies, and how a border studies scholar should really look at the current international situation?
So obviously, scholars should always spend time, should always be aware of the news, but I think we should look at things also based on data and real changes, and and we should also always observe things over a certain period of time. And so the current period is really, in many ways, confusing, agitated in a way. Different parts of the world are still reacting very differently. But one of the trends that has been published about now is a fundamental, very slow and progressive transformation of how states understand, in a way, sovereignty and borders and the relationship between sovereignty and borders. And I think this is now going away because it pre-existed in a way all of the changes that we've seen. Yes, people will argue it probably started but was ignored by the political elite, at least in Europe and I would say in the West, um, with the invasion of parts of Ukraine by Russia in almost 11 years ago, 12 years ago. And and it's not, this is just maybe the media, the best mediatic example of those changes. It's a fundamental contestation and refusal to accept, in a way, some of the principles established after the Second World War, whereby sovereign borders are ultimately um, recorded in the UN. They're well established by not just peace line or end of war treaties, but they are recorded by border treaties. And they stay and are stable. And that fundamental change takes, in a way, different aspect in the way people have discussed sovereignty. So, for instance, one of the things that has been emerging in the last few years, and I would say it's quite recent, is that there is an evolution of how we govern, or the governance of sovereign borders. Physical and digital sovereignty are evolving, in other words, right? So you have ways of implementing a given state sovereignty because of new technologies of information communication. One of the things that I have published about has to do with the functionality of borders and how functional digital, in a way, sovereignty is being, in a way, observed across the world, right? So that change, I think, is really important. The 21st Century Border Research Program that we have currently here at UVic obviously looks at this through different ways of studying governance of borders across the world. But, we did a book, for instance, on Canada-US border with Christian Leprech and Todd Attalay. And in that book, we basically explained that the bordering, the governance of the border between Canada and the US, whether we like it or not, is much more networked than it was understood to be in the past. There is, there are, and that I would say that's one of the fundamental change I've talked about, the functionality of borders. But there are very specific ways in which we can also document this, or colleagues have documented this change. And I'm going to go into this, but first I want to say one of the observation when we see this phenomenon appearing is that we see, in a way, or we observe that there is kind of a fragmentation of the geopolitics, right? There is this idea that many more areas of the world are trying to, border regions in many cases, are trying to secede from established states that have been established, for instance, and recognized by the international community. In other words, they are fully fledged members of the United Nations. And so you have this phenomenon of, in a way, geopolitical fragmentation, which I think is a really interesting one, but it's the one that is the most, in a way, disturbing or difficult to understand, because we kind of look at it as if it never existed before. We tend to forget, but if we look at this from a perspective that is inscribed in even a short history, we realize, for instance, that most of the boundary lines and most of the dyads, that, pieces of the boundary lines that divide two states, for instance, most of the dyads worldwide are only about 60 years old, right? Because they have emerged at the end of the Second World War, 60, 70 years old. And I would say 90% of the dyads today are dyads that were, in a way, solidified by treaties at the end of the Second World War and during the period of decolonization that actually comes afterwards. That to say that even the stability of the international system and the borders that divide them is fairly recent. So when you talk about a state, let's say, that is 75 years old, actually that's a really old state. It's not just 75 years old. Most members of the United Nations today have had well-established borders less than 50 years ago or less than 40 years ago. And people tend to forget this, right? That stability, which we have taken for granted, I would say, in the 90s, the turn of the century, and so on and so forth, today is definitely being challenged. And it takes different form. One, as I said, is the fragmentation, geopolitical fragmentation, with more tension and conflict between established members of the United Nations and their peripheries, but also the fact that states, larger states, have also decided that they can use their technological and military power to help minority movements in different parts of the world to further that fragmentation because it serves their realist interest. So I think that's really kind of a way to set it up. I can go in more details on this. There is lots of literature, but we can start with that. Yeah.
Yeah, fragmented geopolitics. is a very, I think we need to work on this theme, what fragmented geopolitics really mean. Uh, Now, coming to the second question, your work, Emmanuel, have highlighted instances where local cross-border interactions contrast with the formal national level border policies. Now, could you please share some examples where bottom-up governance or a people-to-people engagement has effectively reshaped border management? I know you have worked a lot on this, but yeah,
Yeah,
some examples.
so yeah. So to answer the sovereignty question and the geopolitical fragmentation, we talk at a certain level, which is mostly the level of the state. We look at how, these different units of the international system basically react to one another. And they have a platform called, obviously, the United Nations. There are many other platforms to discuss this. And there are members today that do not really recognize the role or the foundational role of the United Nations. A few years ago in the United Nations, there was a charter that was recognized for the rights of indigenous people. And it's a very important legislation, which is today recognized by certain provinces in Canada. And so I'll just start at home, right, in a way to answer that second question, that in Canada, in British Columbia, where I live, that legislation or that charter, UN UNDRIP, really has had a huge impact on the activism of indigenous communities. And I think it's not exceptional. I would say it is contested and it remains contested, but it is not exceptional to Canada. It's an ongoing discussion. And so what we observe, for instance, when we look at border security, when we observe, for instance, the evolution of legislation and specific treaties that have to do with indigenous nation and indigenous communities on the Canada-US border, we see appearing very specific agreements or piece of legislation, regulation, that creates exception to national rule or to statewide rules and give certain powers to indigenous communities. For instance, to hunt across a border, an international boundary, or to cross the international boundary for family reasons or for ceremonies and so on and so forth. And this, I would say, this is kind of it's already an old idea. I would say that, for instance, there's today there is even agreements among indigenous nations, for instance, for natural life to cross the border among their territories, and it's a way to challenge the international boundary line. It's a way to challenge, obviously, the dominance of the settlers' view or the Western view of what the international boundary is, because a lot of those people obviously do not recognize the international boundary that divides Canada and the US as theirs. And the argument goes that that was not the boundary that existed in the past. And also, the idea of a line itself is contested by indigenous nation because they used to divide land or territory, not with the kind of technology that we have, but in a seasonal manner and in a usage. They used to divide it from the perspective of usage. So the indigenous views are extremely interesting for those reasons, but also because finally we give them voice and we listen to what they have to say. Most governments in Canada and the US only listen in courts. There are negotiations going on, however, and these mechanisms, these discussions, in a way reshape border crossing experience. And they focus our attention on treaty rights and the right of indigenous nations. And when I talk about treaty rights, I go back to original treaties between colons and First Nations, or the nations who were there first, and in recognizing the purpose and the purpose and the land. So I think so that's just one example, but there are other examples, for instance, in Latin America, where you see constitutions like in Bolivia, where the rights of the First Nations are kind of enshrined inside the constitution and have had impacts on, for instance, environmental policies, the right of certain species, and so on and so forth, and indigenous. So policy arenas then are all, are incorporated in those discussions, and I would say protected and enshrined in constitutions. It has gone even farther with giving rights, for instance, to aspects of the land, like a river or a mountain or a forest being protected in right. And this is something that has been observed, discussed, contested, obviously, in many different countries across Latin America, but also Australasia. So if you look at, for instance, the work of people in Maori, for instance, people in New Zealand or in Australia, you see that these are agendas that have, in a way, redesigned and reconceptualized the way we understand boundaries and their role across states. And maybe for some, these are still exceptions, but it's a trend, and it's a very profound and important trend in my mind, because in a way, it's a contestation worldwide of the international state system and certain of the principles that they have, right? The idea, it puts in question the idea of sovereignty, we put in question the idea of the boundary line. And then, so that's one aspect, but there's another aspect, in a way very different, but also quite interesting, which is what we observe in the European Union, where people talk about pooling sovereignty together, right? So there you have the case of 27 states today, and more, because more states are preparing to join the European Union. People talk about having a European Union with, more than 30 states in the next few years, where certain functions, sovereign functions, are basically completely pulled at the level of the Union. Economic functions. So see, we're not talking about the power of communities there, but what's really interesting is that it has an impact on cross-border communities and their borderlands. So today there is the development in the European Union of a common law of borders, and the states have agreed to implement very specific bureaucracies that only deal with the cross-border activities of cross-border communities within the borderlands of the European Union member states. European cross-border regionalism, certain programs like the inter-region program are now extremely well funded with billions and billions of euros. They have developed data sets that are specific to borderlands. They have data, statistics, very precise statistics that allow now those different border regions to, in a way, not only be a political voice, but being economic development instruments with their own views of their future. And it runs, in a way, counter to the vision of the states, but in the case of the European Union, it is actually worked with the help and the administration of the central states. So, for instance, France and Germany are weaving together those programs in relationship with the local communities, working alongside the local communities to develop not only infrastructures, but educational programs, social programs, economic development programs, whereby the cross-border region is really at the core. Why is it so powerful in the EU as an example? It's because even the European Union and the member states have realized that about 35% of the territory inside the EU, inside the European Union, is made of borderlands. Even when you look at this in a very, I would say, narrow view of the statistics, it still is 35%. But most of it, which I think is really interesting, is that it's 40% of the population. And so it has huge political consequences, which are really interesting. Now there is another phenomenon that I absolutely want to emphasize, but it's that in the area of surveillance and cross-border management and cooperation, under the leadership of the European Union, today there is about 85 or almost 88, 90 states that have signed with the European Union, but most of the time they sign these agreements with each other that are called IBM, the Integrated Border Management Agreements. And in the Big Lab, we have a study of these integrated border management agreements and their role. And you can see that these are really specific security-driven agreements that are designed at the local level and that, yes, are multi partnerships. They involve the local, the regional, the national levels, but they also involve both sides of the borders, both at the local, regional levels as the drivers of the mechanisms that enforce the governance of security, mechanisms of governance and security. So, if outside of all these examples, we can see 85 states, that's way more than 27. By the way, it involves Canada and the US, it involves a lot of African states, it involves states that are outside of the European Union. And it's quite interesting to see that that's another phenomenon that I think is really interesting. I talk about the European Union, but I want to talk and maybe conclude on that question with a very interesting example, which is what is called Peace Parks. The Peace Park Foundation was created on the east side of Africa, and it has implication for many of the states that are there. The Peace Park is a huge area of these African states that are on the eastern side, start with South Africa, goes across Zimbabwe, and all the states that are there. It has the size of Italy today. So if you look at the land of Peace Park and the Peace Park Foundation, what we see is an area the size of the country of Italy, and some will say, well, in Africa it's quite small, and I agree, Italy is quite small when you place it inside Africa, but it's a reference when we look at maps and geopolitics because it's a well-known country. And Peace Parks today was set up by the states and by foundation and by leaders, by an elite, obviously, but it is entirely managed bottom up by indigenous communities with the goal of maintaining peace, obviously, but also of not interfering at all with fauna and natural population of all the animals that live there, right? So it's another example, it's another form in a way where you have kind of an agreed upon partnership between local communities and the states to establish a community-driven area. So there is obviously a network of peace parks, there is a network of natural reserves. We have all of those in the Borders in Globalization database, and I know that maybe there's 300 different peace parks and other forms of parks that are cross-border in a way across the world. And all of them, in most instances, are community-driven. And we can find them obviously in Asia, in certain parts of Asia. We can find them in Latin America. It's quite interesting to observe that in Latin America. Obviously in Africa, as I just described, we have probably the world most exemplary example, right? We don't find them in North America. There are peace parks, by the way, on the Canada-US border, but they do not have the size of Italy. So I think that the prime example is really what is called the Peace Park Foundation out of Zimbabwe and some of these other countries. So these are some of the examples that I have in mind when I document these.
No, not some, Emmanuel. I think we have covered almost all the continents, from Latin America to Europe to Peace Park, even to Africa as well. Thank you. And that is why we wanted you to be interviewed, because your presence here will add a lot of value to our viewers and also people who are interested in border studies. But this brings me to another question, and that is related to number of issues that we are discussing nowadays, and it is related to climate change, forced migration, resource-driven tension around borders. So, what innovative policy framework do you believe are essential to turn contested borders into zones of cooperations?
Yeah. I think for the natural environment, there are certain boundaries that have to do with climate, but they are completely oblivious to us, right? We have focused on land when we've divided the world, human beings, and technology, for the Harrison Clark and the Sextant to start with GPS today, in a way, has all our attention. We really want to control the land. We really want to implement. And that's the Western view. And I would say that's a colonized view also of the world. It's not, as I said, many indigenous nations across the world would contest that this is the best way to do this, and that seasonal uses of the land are much more important. But certainly for climate, where we have absolutely no control, whether it is, you know, rain or wind or temperature changes, access to water even, we have very little. We have tried to control, and we have very little ability to control. So on the Canada-US, for instance, since 1901, 1902, we've had the International Joint Commission, which is the only international body between Canada and the US that actually has a very specific function delegated by both states and has both a board and also, in a way, an adjudicating committee, right? An adjudicating capacity, which is, in case of dispute, you refer the dispute to that body. And it is staffed, it's fairly small, and it is staffed, and it manages basically waterways, the Great Lakes, which are massive containers of clear water, not salty water. I think it's 21% or 22% of the world clear water today. But it extends, the International Joint Commission mandate extends from the Pacific coast where I live all the way to the Atlantic. And it has managed water. And then it's been supplemented by treaties, like some of the treaties that we have here in British Columbia, by which water that is on the Canada side is in a way rerouted so that the US side has access to water. There is similar agreements with Mexico Um, and I will say this much, it's that it also exists. But the point is that we need such instruments in a way to manage access or to simply manage um, the impact of climate change. Many countries do this at their own peril by not doing anything, right? They don't collaborate across boundary lines, and so they have the inability to actually see major issues appear. When a few years ago we had a huge forest on one of the parts of the northern part of Alberta, and there was a flume cloud that was probably about 1,000 kilometers that came out of that region and started moving eastward and had a huge impact on the northeast region of the United States. But we knew where it came from, and we could observe, and we have documented, right, the impact that it had, the number of the temperature rising, for instance, in the summer, and the number of issues that have arisen out of this. So so in some regions of the world, an awareness of the climate transformation, but also just an awareness of how dependent we are on the natural environment, access to water, air quality, air pollution, are just two of them, right? Then can lead people to collaborate and to work better with each other. When I arrived in British Columbia, there were almost no relationships. So, we're talking about the mid-90s, we're talking about 30 years ago. There were trading relationships in the Cascadia corridor, so between Vancouver, the Vancouver region, and the Seattle region, and even a little bit farther north and south. A lot of trade, a lot of interaction, but very little cooperation. But in one area, which was in the area of monitoring the impact of climate or climate impacts on the whole region, especially for air quality and for water quality and for access to fisheries, because it's a region that has almost 1,000 islands on both sides of the boundary line and is very rich in this area. So I'm just explaining from a North American perspective how this, in a way, is set and what implication it has. Despite the technology, the idea of climate change remains contested in certain countries. There are political movements that think it's a farce. But we also know that the scientific community worldwide is in full agreement that there is climate change and that it's impacting not just a region of the world, but the entirety of the world, and that it has to, in a way, have an impact on state-to-state relations. It has obviously had an impact in certain parts of the world. And I can come back to the European Union or certain agreements that exist in Africa or in Latin America. But or even at the worldwide level, right, with certain regional climate mitigation agreements, it has had in some parts of the world, and it will have in some part of the world, much more of an impact than in others, especially the parts that are quite very much at sea levels. And so one country that people think about very often, obviously, they're all the island states of the Pacific that are concerned, with certain island states that, might be completely displaced. But there are also countries like Bangladesh and other countries across the world that have that proximity with water. There are certain communities in my own province of British Columbia that are very much concerned by water levels and see that at high tide on a day of, I would say on a difficult day at sea, they are at risk, and certain infrastructures have to be either given up or they have to be strengthened because the water basically can eat roads and so on and so forth, right? And so we have this situation everywhere. It has led to the development of all kind of cross-border activities. And, it's quite interesting to see that we can say most in the states that are most open to this discussion, and once again, I come back to the European Union here, there are states that have agreed to develop anti-programs that deal with climate change impact, border cooperation zone, regional investment, in climate resilience, and so on and so forth have appeared. And you have, especially in the European Union, many different forms and investments that are driven by local communities, cross-border communities in cross-border region, to address this transformation. But again, it contested. There have been inroads in North America, and right now the United States government is not very much in favor of those, so they've rolled back most of the policies. But there are other parts, like, I'm thinking about mostly the European Union, Latin American and African states, where these are, better established, especially when you share a large waterway like the Amazon. You cannot really completely ignore these things. When you have boundaries like the boundary of the Amazon River that can move 50 miles on a given season, right? You are fully aware of these things. The tidal of the river changes, and so the boundary of the states that are that share basically this river are really concerned, and it goes quite far in, and not just in the delta region, but so you have to be fully aware of this, and you have to, in a way, accommodate. Maybe you only have your regional view, but you then become an example. And I'm thinking, there are, for instance, even regions as far as the Andes, along the Brazilian border, where harbor cities have started collaborating on these issues, and their examples, their colleagues in Latin America publish on these things, right? And they look at the impact of climate change on water levels in the rivers and the impact on the cities and the economic activities, the mobility of people across these regions. So these are kind of a few examples to kind of address this question that I just thought. Yeah, I hope it answers the question.
Yes, yes, very much. Uh,
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Emmanuel. And this brings me to another question. And thanks, because the way you explained that how climate is issue. But one of the issues that border scholars all over the world are quite interested in knowing, and because you are with us, I'm sure a lot of people are expecting this answer from you, and that is related to the US-Canada border, which is historically been considered as a global model for cooperation and border management. But in a recent political frictions have raised a lot of concerns. From your perspective, from your scholarly perspective, how might this debate influence the bilateral border cooperation that US-Canada have? I know you have a lot of work on this, and I cannot let you go without getting an answer to this question.
Yeah. So yes, indeed. I mean, I even wrote about the border disappearing at one point, and we are in a completely different perspective today, obviously. So I think that, but so first of all, thank you for that question. And I fully agree that in the last few months, things have really changed in a way, in a very unexpected manner. I still stand by the book that we did on Canada-US relation at the border, which is edited by Christian Leprecht and Todd Attalay. where we show that border security and border management across the region, right, across the whole boundary line, including Alaska, is more regionalized and requires, in a way, regionalist governance of the security, whereby what drives, in a way, the foundation of border security are um, fundamentally written in the economic and human activity across those boundary lines, or these two dyads, right? So security in Alaska, but also security in the Pacific, in the Cascadia corridor is not the same as security across the prairies, or the Great Lakes, or the highly urbanized Ontario, Quebec, kind of the top of the Appalachian Mount, right? And then the Atlantic provinces. And if you're not aware of this, on either side of the boundary line, you are empowering all kind of activities that will exploit your inability to understand kind of the particulars, the singularity of each one of those regions. That said, as I premised my answer, there has been some fundamental changes, and I think it's important to highlight them. Today, the example of cross-border security and good relationship is not between Canada and the US anymore, and it's premised in an article that I published a few years ago where I compare Canada-US with Canada-European Union relationship, which I think at the time I had no idea how true these foundations have even in a way given rise to the situation that we have today. And then in this article, I talk a little bit about what is the institutional proximity of Canada with the EU versus the proximity of the soft governance, the soft power that Canada has always hoped to exercise in the United States. And I had identified in this work that the proximity with the EU was not even comparable. It was so much more sophisticated and so much more advanced, and it involved so many more people from Canadian Parliament, Canadian diplomats, and so on and so forth, that were almost on a monthly relationship with their peers in the European Union. Whereas with the United States, we have some commissions, and today, most of that work basically has been completely overhauled. So maybe the title of the answer could be, we are shifting from a cooperative mode, right? But it's not collaborative. And that's a really important, again, to make reference to some of my writing. I make a difference between coordination, cooperation, and collaboration. And I have published on this, and I'm preparing a book where I compare the different regions of the world in these three categories only. Canada-US used to be in cooperation. We are going back to a much more transactionist, in a way, much more utilitarian and very limited type of cooperation that is more like a coordination of activities, whereas we're moving towards a much more collaborative form of activities with the European Union. The fundamental difference between cooperation and collaboration is that in collaborative forms of, let's say, governance, you are actually codependent. You seek economies of scales in the areas where your partner is the strongest. So you will maybe rely entirely on the partner for those areas while they rely on you for the areas where you're the strongest. And so there is a complementarity of policy goals in collaboration, whereas in cooperation, the policy align at the boundary line. And in coordination, you don't have real cooperation. I mean, in coordination, you are starting to withhold information, you don't meet regularly, and so on and so forth. So Canada, US today, because of the tariff-induced pressure and the reassessment of, in a way, the reliability of, policies of first response, the first responder leitmotif that was really discussed at length post 9/11, where the idea was whether trade or security was the most important, right? And then the whole idea was said this way: security trumps trade, or trade trumps security, right? In the way it was understood in North America, whereby for a while on the US side, Canadians really accepted that security should trump trade, with hope that at some point trade would trump security. But when you look at trading activities, despite, in a way, the codependence, Canada is the largest economic partners for the US, but only at about 20%. And the US is the largest economic partner for Canada with about 80%. But again, it's very important to know that it's also because of very specific sectors, right? Canada-US car production is completely codependent. You can't produce a car effectively in the Great Lake regions if the construction, the assemblage of the car is not crossing the border a number of times, because the components are made on both sides of the border, right? So obviously, when you look at this between Michigan and Ontario, Michigan in the US and Ontario on the Canadian side, you realize that it's one industry across a boundary line, but they're so dependent with each other that if you have a strike on one side, or if the border is closed, this production chain stops completely. They're completely integrated. So under the Trump policies, there are a number of areas, the tariff policies, right? There is a number of areas that are, in a way, back on the table for negotiation. People talk about a new economic deal where tariffs obviously are penalizing Canada heavily. And I would say not only just Canada, but certain sectors of the North American economy, both, as you know, because I illustrated this, car industry would be one of them, are really affected by this transactionist view. They are, and that's one part of the answer. It's going beyond, and so we can talk about other areas that are heavily affected by this. For instance, negotiation around immigration and asylum, or illegal crossing, or counter drug effects will be affected, because collaboration now is, in a way, in those areas, recedes to cooperation or coordination. And where are the different administrations or the different bureaucracies in the administration of both states talk a lot less and are less able to align on matters of principles. When I did research on the integrated border enforcement team, so we're talking, mid-90s, early 2000, I think I did 3 or 4 or 5 papers on this. But at the time, what I thought was so interesting is that on the Canada-US side, the negotiation that you saw between border guards, whether it's CBP or the RCMPs, we were discussing the details of arrest procedures, right? The idea was complete interoperability, knowing that you were on one side of the border or the other. For instance, who will step on a boat in my region of the world, where there's so many islands, if the two officers on their cross-border boat and in their cross-border activities one from the US, the other from Canada, will step on the boat that they want to go and look at. These procedures were completely effective, were discussed in the greatest details. The rule of law that applied was also discussed. And so the officers were in a way, co-national legal environment whereby they were able to collaborate effectively, right? This is obviously now is in question and can, down the road create situations that are quite complex and I would say of almost complete security realignment in the management of the border. There are certain agreements that have not been touched. For instance, you still cross the border in Canada when you go in the US by plane, and certain documents still exist. For instance, you still have enhanced driver's licenses, you still have sharing of databases and so on and so forth. But obviously, these are things that are now, in a way, of the old cross-border discussions, and new ones are going to come in place. And frankly, I don't know the details because the last few months have been rather unstable, and it's kind of difficult to track the tendencies. But I would assume that they will lead to certain realignment. It could be realignments of military agreements. It could be realignments around digital activities, all of which obviously have a huge impact on both economies. Um, uh, and, some of those are only starting to emerge. A lot of the cross-border networks, especially the cross-border, the economic networks, and I'm thinking, for instance, about the amazing work that has been done by the Pacific Northwest Economic Region based out of Seattle, but that brings together 5 territorial units of Canada. So you've got 3 provinces and two northern territories, and then you've got 5 states on the other state, US states on the other side. And they've been working together since the 1980s at basically erasing the border, discussing all kind of issues that happened at the border, but also in cross-border networks, in cross-border trade, in cross-border labor needs, and so on and so forth, in cross-border environmental issues and in cross-border energy management. I mean, all of these different, cross-border functions have been worked at. They still are very active. They're still doing all kind of amazing work, but is in a much more difficult environment, I would say, especially on the US side, where there's, in a way, a reticence, right? There is a kind of a less enthusiasm, let's say, to say. And so, again, to come back to what I started with, we were in a cooperative environment. For me, we're going back to a coordinating environment. And overall, it's a much more utilitarian view of what matters and what doesn't matter. And so I would call it a transactionist environment. Other colleagues have written on this with a fundamental renegotiations, and that's not public yet. And I haven't done any research in the last 5-6 months on this, of the renegotiation of what some call the US MECA, or the Canada US Mexico agreement that is on the table and being renegotiated at this time. So that's my answer to your question.
Thank you, Emmanuel. I hope things will change soon. But Emmanuel, I also have a question because you are here with us. I should take this opportunity to ask this question. See, there's a lot of discussions among the border studies scholar that will there be a day when there'll be a border theory or a theory in border studies? So that's one. And because given your experience in teaching, research, both, what do you think what is the future of border studies? Because a lot of things are going on in different parts of the world. So what is the future of border studies? And also, again, my question, and this is also my personal, question to you is, are we going to have border theory one day? Theory which is acceptable to all.
I think this is mostly a methodological approach answer that I can provide here. So border studies is perceived by many colleagues as emerging out of geography. But actually, it is a very rich field because it has involved many different disciplines. And this is why, I fall back by saying this is really a methodological issue. Some disciplines like to theorize and counter-theorize, and they like to build theories just only because they can just, in a way, use this as a way to build new knowledge and use observation and data to, in a way, deconstruct the theory. And I think that that's really methodological. Others are much more, data driven. Even I would say today, and that's somewhere we can discuss something we can discuss more at length, is the idea that you would have research that is really data intensive and that uses even very large databases, which is one of the an aspect of the work that I have developed inside the Borders and Globalization Laboratory here at UVic. But I think the trends would be they're different areas, right? There is the idea that you should decolonize the research, for instance. And I think that's a really important one because it puts a focus on different voices and different communities to understand, border works, for instance, or to understand the geopolitics of borders, as we've already discussed, right? So this is also very important because it doesn't have the state gaze on everything that is assumed, right? Like if you use large databases, one of the issues is that all the data come from the states, and it's very difficult to basically have a non-state view of the border because very little data actually has been collected in borderlands, which is one of the things the European Union is kind of rewriting in this area. So the decolonization of the research can be a perspective, can be a framework to rethink about borders, whereby indigenous communities then have a voice, but also in a way drive the research agenda from their own perspective that are not always understood or known in the Western world. Let's put it this way: in Europe, in North America, colleagues even sometimes struggle with the idea of even thinking who is or what is an indigenous nation. And I think that in other parts of the world, your part of the world, for instance, this is something that can also be at some point put into question, right? There are many indigenous nations in the borderlands of India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and so on and so forth. But the boundary lines are so hard in that part of the world that it's difficult and we can go to Africa and raise the same issues with, other issues that have to do with the mobility of indigenous nations that are not always bound to a very specific territory, but move from one to another, cross the Sahara, for instance, or live in the southern part and move regularly and trade regularly between different networked cities across different parts of that region of the world. So when we think theory of borders, I think maybe it makes sense to talk about a diversity of frameworks, of views, but also methodologies to approach the questions of in a way of border and bordering and what we observe. Is there a push for multi-paradigmatic approaches and a consolidation. At one point, I thought it would be fun to have, a broader theory of borders and to look at certain aspects. I think today it's probably quite interesting to look at different kinds of framework, like, an indigenous lands or, but in a way to create questions and create research that highlight aspects that are less geopolitical and more focused, for instance, on the borderlander and the life of people who live in borderlands. It doesn't have to only be indigenous people, as I said, in many parts of Europe, for instance. People live and they are not always identified as European nations. It's the same in Latin America or Africa. But my response is that I think the future of border studies can be maybe conceptual and around certain frameworks that allow us to highlight certain aspects understudied. But certainly, methodologically, I think one of the things that would be a major advance is to study less case studies of border regions and much more compare, but also basically have much more data on all of the dyads of the world and all of the border regions of the world, so that one can have a sense of a specific issue like border governance or border security or environmental management in borders, but with many more examples across the world, both inland and at sea, and identify in a way the uniqueness, the singularity that are of cases then that are exemplars because they embody many variations of other examples found in the world. And so I would say most theoretical work today should first change the methodological approach that remains really fundamentally written in doing case studies. We have colleagues who specialized in Finnish-Russian border, for instance, and we see that they're also interested in other borders of the world. We have colleagues who are more interested, but this is also because of their location. They're interested in Latin American borders, for instance, or borders that are rivers. And so I can see this, but I would say the ability to have larger data sets and many more examples becomes, in a way, the real innovative part in border research. And so, I'm kind of dodging the theory question by saying, well, I think the advances are more in the capacity that we have today to collect huge amount of data and then use it to do research. So in sum, I would say, and to conclude, I would say that mixed methods using both large data sets and case studies, training students to learn to do elite interviews, but also to collect data in certain areas. It could be water management, it could be air quality, but across many different instances of the world, I think is the future.
Thank you. A very strong point, Emmanuel, you make, decolonize research. I don't know. It's a very progressive point, and I think yes, we need to work on that. And I know you are also heading a very big project, which is Border in Globalization project, and we definitely like to know from you, what is this project all about, and how do you think it's going to help the border studies scholar all over the world, and what are the contributions of PIG?
So we are almost at the end of the second part of that project, and we've been at it for 12 years, and we have maybe a year and a half to go, but the last part will really be about um, writing reports, finishing the publications, and also probably will try to keep on going for a little bit. The project started with this idea that studying borders should be done from a multifaceted view, and that we could not just study borders from the perspective of the states. The statist view has been criticized by colleagues, that have looked at what is going on in borderlands, so in the border regions, basically. And I just made the case that methodologically, I think this is good, but it's insufficient because what we really need to do is compare regions across the world that are borderlands. We also need to look at how states react, to have kind of a globalist view. And when we do this, we tend to see, in a way, at least two broad perspective, which is the geopolitical perspective of borders, the discussion that we did in the first part of the interview, the fragmentation, and then obviously the focus on indigenous and local population, borderlanders, I call them, people who live in the borders. That's only two views, right? It's a top-down and bottom-up. But then there are all kind of different issues that are there that are also very, very interesting to look at. And today, in the Borders and Globalization research, I would say, program or agenda, we look at many different domains. We look at the history, we look at the culture, we look at the governance, we look at the trade, we look at mobility of individuals, we look at environmental situation, we look at the whole ecological issue of border management, and also we look at AI, the impact of AI on these different dimensions, and I can discuss this a little bit more. And we also look at the security situation. But every time we basically look at the bottom-up part from the perspective of indigenous people. So we basically assume that across the world, the peripheries of states are still mostly populated by indigenous people. People who have been displaced and affected by borders and boundary lines, and people who have had no voice, either to say we don't want the border there, or this is a huge imposition on our culture, our history, of way of living, our way of understanding the universe, right? Because the modern state system is kind of a European invention of the Westphalia Peace and so on and so forth, and has really, even when we look at the UN, all of these ideas came from the period of all of the ideas and fundamental assumptions, that of sovereignty, that of boundary, that of exercise of violence within each territory as a sovereign power, and so on and so forth. All of these were established, in the 1600s, and were basically promoted across the next 400 years to embody, in a way, the post-Second World War peace agreements and institutions. And so these ideas have been embodied, in a way, in the UN and all of the bodies that work around the UN, the different other institutions there. And so I would say that our view that indigenous nations need to have a voice is extremely, but I would say it's conceptually fundamental and extremely important to the future of border studies, because it puts in question if only theoretically, but also in a way, I would say, as a matter of building block of the world, it puts into question the existence of the states. And so it becomes a tool to study and understand borderlands, and boundary lines as well, but not just from the perspective of the states, from the perspective of lived, right? The whole idea of border works was a way to approach this. It's just that I see this as a much broader concept, or much more important and leverage, in a way, a leverage inside the literature to question a lot of assumptions. So that's kind of a way to underscore this and to say the two dimension remain, but the dimension, the bottom-up dimension, which is premised on the existence of nations, indigenous nations, and borderland populations that in a way rediscover who they are despite the trauma of border boundary and diet construction, boundary line and diet construction, has a huge impact, obviously, on the literature and allows us so. So, for instance, I have developed ideas such as aterritoriality, and I think that having looked at mobility of people across boundary lines can then lead to understanding that certain parts of the global activities are really based on mobility of humans and also trade flows. And so that these connections, in a way, completely transform the way we understand bordering, right? And it can go even farther. The expression of sovereignty can be done through a machine like an artificial intelligence machine, whereby a sovereign state wants to control the production chain or the value chain, specific good, and can trace that because of technology as far as across many different countries and maybe thousands of subcontractors that are active in many different countries. And I know that the work done, for instance, around custom works and by, for instance, firms like Altana AI, really operationalize, makes it very real, the ability to document the entire value chain of a good from the perspective of, let's say, US or European Union legislation, right? Whereby thousands of subcontractors have to enter into the machine their information because the goods that they are making, let's say a button for a shirt, will end up in the United States or on a US market. So the expression of sovereignty is really become part of the trade tool, and it's controlled by the artificial intelligence. And it's not very difficult to just check Altana AI and to look at how they sell their goods. They sell that ability. They tell you that they've tested it with, for instance, LL Beans, which is a major shirt maker. They make clothes and they dress North American people. They've done this for generations. And now they can trace the value chain and the production chains everywhere across the world. And it's the same for a car, it's the same for a computer, it's the same for everything. And the expression of the sovereignty then comes into, I'm the country of destination of that good. I want to control whether there is child labor in country X in the fabrication of that component of the computer that will then be bought in my country, or on that button, as I said, and so on and so forth. So the legislation and the process of implementing the sovereign legislation goes through the whole process of documenting and controlling the value chain. And then you have, for that one good, the issue is that just to keep on working with the example of the United States, customs will check. They will have the tools. And so they have the ability to say, we have a problem with that component. We want to know where that component comes from and in what condition has it been built, and so on and so forth. And so customs can do this. This technological change, which is about sovereignty and an expression of sovereignty and control of a value chains across many different territories, many different states, but also thousands of subcontractors, can be applied to human mobility. And that is a very important game-changing activity whereby you can almost score every single human being or those who carry actually the rights of being human beings, because parts of the world, obviously, there are people who are not considered human beings in law, right? That's why they are in camps. That's why they have no rights to move. And yet we're talking about millions of people today that are very often in borderlands, in camps held by and funded by, let's say, the European Union, or, there is such issues about Rohingyas in Bangladesh. And, I can go on, but I'm just giving two examples in the United States, in Latin America, and other parts of the world, where AI can basically be used to control the mobility of human beings and where you can almost call them as it is done in certain countries of the world where mobility is controlled by technology. For instance, in China, where people have, social mobility indexes depending on their political activities and so on and so forth. And so if they want to buy a ticket in their city of origin to go to a bigger city across China, maybe they can't because the computer will tell the agent that person cannot leave the city, and so you can't sell them a ticket. So we have that technology today. And so Big is really interested in these things. And Big has done this in a way in facet studies because the agenda is so vast, right? So we've looked, for instance, at indigenous population. We've looked at certain security agreements. We've looked at environmental conditions in certain parts of the world. And we have created data sets that allow us in a way to identify the most interesting, and we have to justify it, right? The most interesting cases to be studied much more in depth. We look at this. We have, I think, started to publish articles. We might have 4 or 5 out, but we have a special issue also that is under review right now. And then we are starting to do this on transportation network, on water transportation network, on road network and road grids across continents, and so on and so forth. So we have started to look at different facets of these different agenda. And I have also done, but that's only me, and so it's very small because one person obviously is just a way to foray into this. But I have started to look very carefully at what I just discussed, which is the impact of AI on the extension of sovereign power across the world, across either markets, but also across I guess the mobility of individuals across the world. And then I've worked with Jeff Contassel, who is a colleague here for Professor at UVic, who's originally from indigenous nation, has a lot of interest in the trading activities of indigenous nations, and has, in a way, further this agenda, but from an indigenous perspective. And we've looked at different facets of this, looking at, for instance, modification in regulatory system, legal systems, and how these things are evolving for indigenous nations. It's very important to go, obviously, to these legal systems because they imply natural person power. They imply the recognizance of, people who have full rights. And we are talking about people who have not had full rights, who have not had natural person power for generations. So that's one aspect where you can kind of do research, not only to empower those communities, but also to identify the huge potential for different views on what borders do, and what boundaries and diets do to those communities, and how they question the existence of those communities as they rediscover and reassert their rights, and their right systems, their right environments in a way at par with colonized right systems or previously fully empowered systems of rights that have negated their existence. In Canada, for instance, we have this issue um, with the Indian Act that doesn't give natural person power to most indigenous people who live on reserves. And so, we're moving from a perspective of the world where you do not exist as a human being until you are recognized certain rights and have the ability then to kind of reconfigure and re-question entirely the legal system, which is that of the colon and the settlers, right? So Big has done this, and I think for the future, it has to keep on working on this kind of moving discussions. And as I said, when I won the second large grant, 21st Century Borders, I would put the emphasis on indigenous communities and indigenous nation. And I think that for the future, it would be really interesting to be able to do much more in this area, as well as in the area where we look at the impact of technological change, so which is the role of AI, and what it means for this further extension of sovereign power across, in a way, the world, right? Or across certain regions of the world as it seems to be discussed now. And whereby, under the agenda of, in a way, securing certain parts of the world, sovereign powers will want to have the ability to control everything that moves thanks to AI in that region of the world. So all the value chains would be only coming from certain countries, and mobility would also be kind of limited into those different parts of the world. Obviously, these are discussions, but this is kind of the way I see a future agenda in border research.
If I have to say, you are trying to decolonize research through Big, because, as you said, that generally we discuss border through the perspective of the state, and you are taking a bottom-up approach. You're taking the cause of the people and a very progressive agenda, Emmanuel. Now, coming to the last question, because as you know that we are from Asia, and I also know that you are quite interested in Asian borders. You have been to India a number of times. In Asia borders, we look at it's a very securitized, from a very securitized lens, unlike in Europe and in US, Canada. So, how do you think scholars from this region should look at borders? Any advice, any recommendation from your side? Because I know that you have interest, you have followed it. So something from your side to our scholars from this part of the world.
Yeah, so first of all, I don't decolonize, but I work with people who want to decolonize. And I think that, a lot of my colleague Jeff Contasal, for instance, I could not do the work that I do without him, and his network and his colleagues who have these indigenous perspective, because I can't invent them. I'm a white settler. I also, benefit from a beautiful life in North America. I'm also a migrant, all right, a new migrant into this country. I was born elsewhere. And so that's kind of, it's because of a discussion with colleagues like Jeff, and with Jeff especially. We talked for years before we designed the agenda. We talked for a year and a half, actually, once a month. And then we discussed, some of the research strands that he's implementing. So that's really important to highlight. Now, for South Asia, I would say it's difficult from, the perspective that I have and the position that I have as well as, a Canadian immigrant colonizing, who's been in a colonizing system as a professor to give lesson to the other part of the world. Uh, so I don't really have lessons to give. I can only say that, there are certain things in Southeast Asia that I would say are well documented and that we should not forget when we study or when we look at South Asia. One of which is that in South Asia, because it's a little bit like Africa and Latin America, because these parts were first and foremost colonized for generations, there is, in a way, an anxiety about the boundary lines. The boundary lines in many parts of the world, of these worlds, right? I'm talking about 3 continents here, were not established by the people that originally lived in those continents, right? There are boundary lines in Southeast Asia, there are boundary lines in Africa and in Latin America that were basically imposed to the First Nations of these parts of the world. And so there is, in a way, what we can call, a cartographic anxiety, or there is an anxiety about whether the boundaries of the different countries are well set. It's quite strong in Africa with the, I think it's 1967 Cairo Agreement that basically said to all decolonizing countries of Africa that they will have, and they had to sign it, they will have to maintain the colonial borders or to renegotiate each died one by one, right? Which seems like an impossible, insurmountable historical work, right? Which is, and yet the Union of African States has been very active on the border fronts, on delineation, and trying to find ways to reestablish a situation of peace across all its boundaries. So with this premise, I would just say that, one of the things that we cannot ignore ever is that in Southeast Asia, there is a bit of anxiety. There are certain powers that have been obviously, and certain governments that have been very concerned about security approaches. And so in the literature, there are lots of colleagues, and I cannot, I cannot not admit that I've contributed to this view that these are hard borders. They are hard borders. And there are some changes as well, right? Between, for instance, India and Bangladesh, there used to be a lot of exclave and enclaves. And it was written off between the two countries. And then a kind of hard border came in. But the whole point is that population, the borderlanders, have never been recognized as very unique and specific by the states. And the first movement is to say, well, we create a boundary, and then the people will have to just adapt to the boundary. But that's for me a good example of what I would call this cartographic anxiety, which is, not unique, obviously, to Southeast Asia. It still exists in Europe. It exists here in North America as well. But so they, there are issues, I would say, in Southeast Asia with recognizing the uniqueness and singularity of border people. And the European view of this is that they're small regions of the world, or the Western view would be that small regions of the world. One of the things that I've observed, however, and it's similar in Africa and Latin America, is that we're talking about millions of people every time. When we have geopolitical issues, or when we have, for instance, this kind of reconciliation between Bangladesh and India, we are rewriting the boundary line across population that counts millions of people who have no say in where the boundary line is, in a way. And that's something that is driven by the need to agree on the boundary line. It's something that the European Union has been completely uncompromising about when, for instance, I think it's a telling example when, for instance, Poland approached the EU to join in. And there was a dispute between Poland and Germany. And the EU said the disputes over German people who live on the Polish side and Polish people speaking people who live on the German side has to be resolved before you join. And so that's kind of interesting to see that the purpose in that case, historically, when we observe it, is that first of all, you in a way harden the border. You determine where the boundary line is, as it's been the case between Germany and Poland in the 90s. But then you erase the border, which is what's going on right now, where ancestral relations, trade networks, cross-border cities, and so on and so forth are basically undergoing a new life and within the European Union are reappearing. So in Southeast Asia, in a way, if I look at a historical process, I'm thinking the hardening of the border is obviously a necessary period. It doesn't take away the fact that it's a region of the world where the security only and the security first paradigm dominates the literature today. And where the idea of hard borders is everywhere, right? If we look at the 7 dyads of India, we know that all the dyads, in a way, including the ones in the Himalayas, if they're not fully fortified and militarized, they are in a slow process, even with some of the states where India had, almost as good relationships as Canada and the US in the 1950s. You could go across without papers. In Canada, US, you could live on one side and travel without papers. Today, if you don't have your passport, you're not going across either way, right? And biometry is not yet in place. But I think, with, for instance, India and Bhutan, it's kind of interesting because the relationship, in a way, have hardened over time. So this is kind of the implementation of a historical process. But again, I draw from outside, so I don't know what the people of Southeast Asia will do with this. But what I observe is that the realities of borders are very realist in international studies term, right? In other words, we are affirming the boundary line first, and then we have maybe the ability to reinvent our relationship. The India-China relationship is of particular interest in that regard because they are both growing trade partners, yet just a few years ago, and the ongoing, just a few years ago, there was almost war on some of the boundary lines, but at the same time, even though it's de-escalated, it remains a region of tension, but trade has increased at the same time. The trade aspect is particularly interesting between China and India because in the European Union, another part of the world, it was the prime reason to drive peace. It was to increase trade, and it creates huge amount of wealth. And interestingly enough, China has this very experience in the Mekong Delta region, which involves 5 states, right? So the whole Malay area there, with Vietnam and so on and so forth, has really benefited from increased trades. And if you look at the activities of the Asian Development Bank, you realize that it's entirely developed through basically local communities on both sides of those many different borders wanting to trade with each other. But the impact is exponential growth and exponential wealth creation in that region, right? It's one of the regions of the world, the Greater Mekong region, that has created the most wealth and is the most economically integrated in the world today, way more than Europe and way more than North America. We just don't know it, but China has that experience there. So I would say that's kind of the way I see um, um, Southeast Asia. It has, when we look at these experience, it has maybe from far away, we say, oh, yes, they're really hard borders. But there are many different facets to this hardening process. As I said, there is also a lot of areas where, while the process is hardening, there also are more relations and more trade going on around, for instance, water management issues, access to the great rivers, and access to water in the Himalayan regions, right? For instance, if we look at the whole region there are lots of parts where local communities have, in a way, different views than the national powers at stake. And so, environmental and climate migration have happened, but at the same time, you also see that this means that there are certain relationships that remain quite important, and so on and so forth. So it's a fascinating region of the world to study, because in a way these issues are in a way more polarized or harder, right? They're harder issues, um, and and it's a region I think we can learn from a lot. So I always admire my colleagues who do research in a way this difficult context, because the contexts are difficult, but also I think um, they tell us a lot about the situation of the world, and uh, when you are in a post-colonial era, when you're kind of rethinking the world for yourself, it takes a few generations, politically and in terms of policies, um, to kind of determine what's best for a given population. Um, yeah, I mean, technology obviously will play a role. I think we could do lots of studies on this. We could look at, the some of the work that is done on, I think, um, despite the ditch and the fence between India and Pakistan, we could look at, water sharing, for instance, works. We could look at broadly across the region, we could look at um, identity and culture, some of the work you have done, for instance, on even education, schoolwork, and so on and so forth, which is very important and very interesting. And then the impact of digital surveillance across the whole region in borderlands. Um, the phenomena that I described, either in trade with the ability to trace a value chain or to basically control and give coefficients to mobile individuals, is obviously generalizing because the technology exists and it's being implemented across the world. And so a different political system obviously will have different views on how to use this. And democratic states and more authoritarian ones will have different perspective there, which will have an impact on the border policies, right? Because in just to illustrate this and conclude on this, when you look at biometric markers and their usage in the EU, for instance, it's quite fascinating to see that they're quite close to not using passports anymore. Because with the biometry today, you can go across the boundary line, you can travel across Europe completely freely, but you can also enter and exit the European Union domain in a few seconds, like literally in a few seconds. Once the passports are done with, and then you just use biometric markers, people won't even know the border exists within a few years of practice. They'll forget. They'll just walk across a tunnel. It'll be different. But so I'm thinking all these technologies obviously will have an impact, and they can speed up process in some instances or slow them down in others. We'll just see what the people of these different parts of the world want to do. More research for the next generation in a way.
Yeah. Thank you, Emmanuel. A very interesting discussion we had with you. Some very important point you covered, including I really like the idea of contest is geopolitics, also decolonizing research, and of course, bottom-up approach in border studies, which is very important. And of course, one thing more, which is recent, which is new for us, but definitely which is going to impact each one of us in a long run, and that is AI. Uh, I also came to know that you're in this interview that you're also working on a book project related to the US-Canada border. I'm sure this border has generated a lot of interest in the border studies communities over the last 2 years. So we look forward to your book. Thank you very much for being with us and giving us time from your very busy schedule. Thank you.
Very welcome. My pleasure.